Welcome to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus with Bob Mendelsohn.
We're studying tonight 1 Corinthians chapter 11. This is not an easy section of Bible to study because it is so culturally demanding. It's beginning a section of dealing with issues that are passed down from traditions through the apostle to the believers in Corinth. There will be 3 that he's going to deal with, 2 tonight, and 1 he'll begin next week. The 2 tonight have to do with women's roles, and then the Lord's Supper, and then next week, spiritual gifts. So we're going to talk about these in light of the congregation and in light of Jewish understanding. This is a little uncomfortable in light of Penny Wong and her partner having a baby this week, in light of same-sex unions being a new Labor Party mantra, in light of as many deviations as we find. This sounds so 1950s. It sounds so old school, doesn't it? It sounds so inappropriate, not apropos to our world. And yet, brothers and sisters, it is definitively apropos. And it's the way to right the ship when the ship is going all wobbly and going way off course. It's right for us to evaluate our lives against this, not this against our lives. And when we sort that out, that the Bible is right, no matter what I think, then we'll be on good footing. When I talked to an Israeli man here yesterday, and he said, we sat for an hour, and he said, you just think it's true because you believe it. I said, no, I believe it because it's true. When we adjust our faith or our thinking or our emotions towards what's true, we'll be better off than if we adjust what's true to what we think or feel. When I saw, and I did not know that Penny Wong was homosexual. I don't know if that was ever reported. Maybe it was. So maybe I missed it. I didn't know. But when I then evaluated what her arguments were at government and in Parliament about homosexuality, I thought, yeah, her views are slanted. And if she were objective, married to her first husband and had 3 children and they lived in the suburbs, then I would have felt her arguments for homosexuality were in fact objective. But once I discovered, as I saw the photo in the press, that she's already that way, then it's an argument that I found wanting. This book is helping us to understand in a very awkward way how Messiah and the community of faith are to relate. That's what this is all about. So he's giving some correctives. He's been doing that through the book of Corinthians about being judged correctly. Chapter 5 was about sexual impropriety. He's talked about sex several times, but now he's talking about women. And when you read this, in light of the society in the day, women had no rights. This is an exaltation of women. I mean, you listen to these verses that says, verse 11 and 12, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent, choris, of woman, because as the woman originates from the man, that's Eve from the Garden of Eden, so also the man has his birth through the woman. Hey, Charlie, you're not better than the woman. You didn't get here but for Sister Susie. You know, your mother, every fella I know was born from a woman. So don't say you're better than that woman because you came from the better one. So nobody's better. All things, he argues, originate from God. So that's why he's equalizing things. He's like the original women's lib guy, and yet he's not. In this context, he's not arguing for betterness or more dignity for a man over against a woman. He's merely saying we've got relationships that are functional, and we've got to work in a functioning society. And the way they work best is if the man is the head of the woman, and the man submits to Messiah, and Messiah submits to the Father. That's the way it's always been, and that's what he argues in verse 3. If you think this is going to be a lesson of equality, let me say it's about function, not about equality. I want to drive that home. Sometimes there are discussions in the church about Jews, and that there's neither, they use that phrase, neither Jew nor Greek, right? And they argue by that Jewish believers like us shouldn't have our own meetings, shouldn't have our own bookstore, shouldn't have our own community, because, hey, why don't you just join the church? We're all the same. Now, how do you argue that? You argue that from saying, no, we have different functions, but we are equal in access to the Father. That's for sure. Jew and Gentile alike. Neither Jew nor Greek is better. And that's what he would argue here. Male and female are not better. We just have different functions. And if we can sort that out and subordinate ourselves to the greater only in role, not in honor, not in glory. No one's better. Do you hear the difference? If we can sort that out, we'll have happy families, we'll have happy communities, we'll have happy relationships. If we sort out who's who and who I'm not, and who you are and who you are not. So that's what he's arguing. So he says, hey, I'm an imitator of Messiah, so I want you to imitate me. That could be full of chutzpah to talk like that. Can you imagine? Yeah, follow me. I know what I'm doing. But what he's saying is, in the same way I follow Messiah, I want you to follow Messiah. That's the way it's going to work. And what was Messiah? How do we know him? We know him as the humble servant, the servant leader, who's so able to dominate, and yet he chose to die. He chose to give himself. He chose to sacrifice himself. So any man who says, hey, woman, in a husband-wife thing, who says, woman, here's how it works. I'm going to be the boss, you're going to be the little one. Then he doesn't understand. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians is one of 4 books. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. GEPC. That's the order. How do we remember that? Gentiles eat pork chops. GEPC. Now, in verse 22 of Ephesians 5, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord, not to every man, but just to your own husband. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Messiah also is head of the community of faith, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Messiah, so also the wives ought to be to their, own husbands in everything. Wow. Is that culture packed or what? Husbands, love your wives, just as Messiah also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So it's not so he dominated, so he could command her, but so that he could give to her, so that he might, verse 26, sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, without spot, without wrinkle, that she would be holy and blameless. In that same way, verse 28, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. If you love your own wife, you love yourself. That's so sensible. Take care of things at home. So when you really think about it, both husband and wife are designed to serve each other. And when the wife says, hey, I'm not going to, unless you, and dominates, or when the husband says, get in here, woman, bring me my beer and hot dog, evening paper and slippers. We don't understand what it is to love. Love doesn't demand. Love is charitable and gives. And we're going to see that highlighted superbly in 2 chapters, which will be the beginning of our next year. If we understand what love is, we're not going to be demanding. We're going to be generous and giving, serving one another. When you understand that, you'll understand the gospel. Now let's go back to the Corinthian passage. And there are people who argue about this idea of headship is the idea of origin, source, and not authority. I think they've got a real trouble with the Ephesian passage and with this passage to argue that. But they make good points, good arguments. The head of is the source of, according to some. So when it says that the man is the source or head of a woman, it's that Eve came from him, not that he should dominate her. But the word authority is used here, exousia, used here again, related to the woman in verse number 10, that she should have authority on her head. So I think it's an argument from silence to say it's source rather than chain of command. Look, in every society there's a functionality. Somebody has to make decisions, somebody has to be the leader, somebody has to be follower. You remember the book Lord of the Flies? Golding's famous book of these boys who get stranded on a desert island. And they're all going to be equal until somebody says, I think I'll be more equal than others, and starts dominating. By the way, what's the Hebrew for Lord of the Flies? Baal-Zevu, Beelzebub. Which makes sense when you're talking about hell looking like that rubbish tip and that there are flies abounding. So the apostle here is arguing about headship, arguing not argumentatively, but trying to make his point that culture, that theology, that even the Bible is useful to understand how we're supposed to work together in the community of faith. Because he wants equality. Look at this. In verse 4, every man who has on his head something while praying or prophesying disgraces his head, but the woman who's uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. There's something about men and women are equal in public prayer. This is an elevation of women, not a diminishing of women. To say a woman can pray publicly, pretty great. This was written to the Corinthians, so they're not getting their model from Israel. They're getting their model from the pagans and the pagan temples. And a woman who had her head shorn was a prostitute, a temple prostitute in Corinth. And she was elevated in society. She had a recognized title. She was a prostitute. What you saw in Israel today is variant from Corinth 2,000 years. So you've got geographical change, you've got social change, you've got 2 millennia change of humanity.
In Vaikra, if a man suspected his wife of playing the whore, then he uncovered her head publicly. So this is what I'm not reconciling from this passage, because it's saying leave the woman with long hair. She already had the covering on her head. But if you did that in Judaism, you were exposing and humiliating your wife.
Yeah, humiliation is definitely in view here. Let me read to you a couple things from David Stern, because in verse 4 it says, every man who prays in public with his head covered is doing wrong. So should we wear a kippah? Should we wear a skull cap or yarmulke? The Greek is down over your head. This is the literal translation, and it's used here to show that Saul is talking about wearing a veil, not a hat, covering down over your face. This, with his head covered, obscures this fact, and as a result, an issue has arisen in Messianic Judaism that should never have been raised at all, namely the wearing of a kippah. Of course, it is proper, since objection to it is based only on a mistranslation of this one verse in the New Testament. Generally speaking, Orthodox Jews wear kippot at all times, conservative in different contexts, whether they're eating or davening or something, and Reform Jews rarely, if at all. The custom of wearing a kippah has no scriptural basis and is not required even in Talmud. It didn't acquire mandatory status from an Orthodox Jewish viewpoint until the writing of Shulchan Aruch, which is around the 1500s, 16th century, though it had become customary some centuries earlier. In the synagogue, a Jew saying his prayers will sometimes pull his talit up over his head, and he does it in order to create privacy and intimacy. Some call that his prayer closet. That help you when Yeshua said, go into your closet and pray alone. Some Messianic Jews pull up a talit over their head to do that. So he creates privacy and intimacy between himself and God, and that distinguishes this situation from the public praying or prophesying that Rav Shaul, that the Apostle Paul is talking about here. Now, in this idea of the adulteress, Moses commands this in Numbers chapter 5. The Kohen, the priest, is to stand the woman before the Lord and let the hair of the woman's head go loose. That means he removes the headdress from her, symbolizing that was her faithfulness to her husband. He takes that off, and she's now shamed. In the Mishnah, we read this: these are the women who may be divorced and not given the marriage settlement specified in their ketubah. She who transgresses the law of Moses and Jewish custom. And what is meant here by Jewish custom? If she goes out in public with her hair loose, or spins cloth in the street, that is, with her arms exposed, or spends time talking loosely, that's flirting, with all kinds of men. That's from Ketubot 7. So here Saul is not imposing Jewish standards, rather his concern with decorum and shame leads him to want women who believe in Messiah to conform to customs found throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. That's why he says in verse 16, but if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice, nor have the churches of God, meaning we didn't come up with this. This is standard issue in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the way things are done. Women, keep your head covered, wear the veil. Men, don't wear a veil. You be the man. Both in early Semitic and later Greek society, chaste women wore their hair up or under a veil. However, here Paul introduces a transcultural element as well. I thought that was helpful to read about the a veil that I always got confused. Should I wear a kippah? And I felt, well, maybe I could mistranslate this. It was very hard for me to read this in modern practice. I thought, well, it really is culture bound. This is first century Corinth. It's not 21st century Sydney. It's not a synagogue. It's a church. So I was excusing myself left, right, and center. But here, if I understand it right, the man wearing a veil is what he's talking about. And we see that in Muslim society today, don't we? We see men don't wear veils and women do. I had a guy yesterday come in the shop, and it was fascinating. He was part of a fundamentalist Baptist church and wanted to know my views on certain church practices, baptism, adult versus child, yada, yada. And I said, next you're going to ask me if I follow the King James Bible only. Let me tell you, I read the Greek and I read the Hebrew, and I'm happier there. And he said, oh. And I said, here's the problem. You think that, and he had listed a few things that he thought were wrong that some Christians did, but that his church didn't do. And what he defined them as was Bible versus tradition. I said, well, let me ask you, in your church, does your pastor wear a tie and a jacket? He said, oh, yes. I said, where's that in the Bible? I said, in your church, do you people sit in pews and face the back of the guy in front of you? Oh, yes. I said, where's that in the Bible? And what I was trying to help him with was that traditions abound in even the most Bible-only places. Everybody mixes the way they understand. How do you keep the Sabbath holy? What does that mean? I know what it means for me in these days, the way I do it with my family. But what does it mean to you? Jerry, what does it mean to you? Ori, what does it mean to us as we unpack, keep it holy? Zachor, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. What does that mean? So we fill it full with tradition, most of which are okay, some of which enhance the very thing we're trying to learn. Some thwart and cloud it, and we just have to work on it. We put on a mezuzah on our door. Why? Because it says to do that. Does it? No, it says put the words on the door. It doesn't say put a piece of jewelry up there. But we put the jewelry up so that you can put the words inside. That makes sense. But some people just write words on their doorposts. Or my daughter has some Bible words written in chalk, I hope, on the ceiling in her bedroom. So when she lies down at night, she can read the Bible, which I think is pretty great. That's probably more the spirit of it than sticking a piece of jewelry on and the words we never read. You see how traditions are useful at times or thwart at times. We think we're complying when we miss it completely. Everybody does that, though. So I'm looking at this hair thing and wondering, oh my, have I missed this? Have I made a big deal about women having their head covered or not? I think the point is that he's trying to elevate women, saying women can pray and prophesy. What's prophesying?
Adoration and joy, speaking of praises and thanksgiving to God in a frenzy.
So you're seeing the energy behind it and the elevated state.
Maybe preach or teach about some insight that you've had.
Forth-telling, not foretelling. Telling forth the words of God. So I got this idea from Isaiah chapter 5. I want you to hear it. I think this will be good, yada, yada. And you share that rather than, thus says the Lord, on Tuesday at 4 o'clock, this shall happen and the train to Chatswood is going to fall. I mean, that's prophesying Old Testament. But prophesying New Testament, we're going to get to in chapters 12 and 14 what it really is. And I think it is much more preaching and forthtelling than predictive foretelling. But women can do that. That's pretty generous. That's so radical. We don't understand it because we have women we got a prime minister who's a woman. We got a governor general who's a woman. And today we now have an attorney general who's a woman. What a life we have. Half our premiers are women. We don't understand how low women were because our society is so rife with women in leadership and women in, I think, appropriate places. That's fine.
When Muhammad was addressing the issues at that time, that is how it is written now. And it is deemed as a commentary that he actually improved life for women. So if this is how they're living now, and it was indicative of that time, then imagine what they were living like before.
Muslim women, and that's 7th century. We're looking at 1st century, and it's kind of hard to unpack, but I appreciate that. So here's the point, verse 5, don't be disgraceful. If every man has pulled down something over his head, verse 4, he disgraces his head. Who's his head? Messiah, Yeshua, that's right.
In some Western movies I see, a man goes into church, he always takes his hat off.
Yeah.
Is that supposed to be from Corinthians?
That's where they get it. You're exactly right. I went, it was about a year, I was a believer for about a year. And I went to church, this was in Kansas City, at Full Faith Church of Love. What a great place. They've changed their name now to Cross Points, but it's still a terrific place. And Brother Catherine met me at the door and said, you can take your hat off now. And they had a hat rack. And I thought, it's so funny. I go into shul and I put on a hat. And I come into church and I take off my hat. And it was in a way a competition between church and synagogue. Hey, when you come in here, put it on. When you go in there, take it off. Kind of defining cultural boundaries. But in due course, I put my yarmulke back on and I kept attending there. They lived with it. They got over it.
I had this problem in Israel. You are going into the Knesset and you are covering your head. Then you are going to where Mary met Elizabeth, the monastery. Then you are uncovering your head. Then you are covering your head, you are uncovering your head. And
you know, if they just marketed it, it would be smart. You have 25 cents put on a head. The whole point is not to disgrace your head. To bring glory is another way. So one is to shame. The flip side of that is to bring honor. Don't bring shame, bring honor. So how does a woman bring honor to her head? By having her head covered, her personal space. So she wears this headdress or she wears this veil, she wears something that says, I'm not available. Even as we see Muslim women today walking in Auburn or Lakemba, and you can't go up to her and say, hello, sweetheart, I'm going to go on a date. You know, you can't do that because she's taken. And that's what the woman is saying here, I'm taken.
she's not married.
It doesn't address that. It only is addressing the husband-wife thing. It is fascinating. Most people were married.
So would it be the father or the rabbi? Or?
Would be the father. Father of that girl is the head of that unmarried girl. Then the brother. This is so Talmudic. And there are some churches I know that would say, in your situation, without your father, unmarried, who would say that you're under the tutelage and honor of the pastoral staff at the church. So that's what some would say, but then that's not an authority issue, it's a responsibility issue, and that's why church is built for that, but Bible classes are not necessarily for that. And I wish for more, but at this point, this is the reality. So you're designed, women, to honor your head. That's the man. Men, you're designed to honor your head. That's Messiah. Messiah is designed to bring glory and honor to his head, his father. And disgrace is the flip side negative of that. Doesn't nature itself, verse 14, teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor? Really? Where does nature teach that? Here's what David Stern says in his commentary. Does the nature of things itself really teach you that a man who wears his hair long degrades himself? Whether scientific measurement would uphold the assumption that men's hair naturally grows shorter than women's is not precisely the point. Rather, there are natural distinctions between men and women which should not be obscured. Saul is probably in some measure campaigning again against homosexuality and transvestitism. Nature here seems to include not only physical but social and cultural elements. We can theorize that in a culture where men wear their hair long without compromising their male identity and women with short hair are still considered feminine, Saul might not press the issue as he does, which we can see in modern day. I prefer thinking about the aged man and the aged woman. They say that men are twice as prone to baldness as women. We have twice as many genes or twice as many chromosomes or twice as many molecules, something going on upstairs where we lose hair not twice as fast, but twice as likely as women. So when a man who's bald has long hair, it looks weird. Most men with baldness have short hair. The odd rock and roll celebrity with no hair on top but long locks in the back, I guess they feel good about that. Most women who age do not grow bald, and their hair in long or short still looks feminine. I think that's probably more than what David Stern says, more likely here in their age, because he's talking about men and women, not teenagers, boys, girls. Long hair doesn't make sense on a man who's bald, but it does on a woman who is balding or losing more hair as she ages. Either way, the point is this. We didn't invent this, verse 16. If you want to be contentious, go find another world to live in, because we didn't come up with it. So he's coming up with theology, with culture and nature to say maybe not covering your head in a veil, men, is probably good not to cover your head and therefore dishonor Messiah. And ladies, it's good to say I belong to somebody. That's his argument. Whether you like it or not, that's his argument. End of the day, judge for yourselves, verse 13. You decide.
Why do Haredi men shave their head?
The Haredi women shave their head and then they wear the wig. The women in the Orthodox God's world who shave their heads today do that so that only their husband sees them in the most naked fashion. So they expose themselves only to them. But then they buy hair that's even more beautiful
That's right.
than their own hair. Hair's a funny thing, but end of the day, use everything you can to bring honor to God. That's probably where I'm going to leave it. Let's go on to the second, and it won't take at all as long, tradition, and that is the Lord's Supper, as it's nicknamed. And you can see it in verse 24 and 25, the quotes that Yeshua gave that the Apostle Paul has memorized. In verse 23, I received from the Lord what I delivered to you. So this is a typical Jewish traditional transmission. I heard, I received it, and I'm passing it on. This is normal. That the Lord Yeshua, the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. Wow, what a funny way to say on Passover night. What a funny way to say at his last Seder, on the night in which he was betrayed, because it's all about relationships. And he's going to seal us as being part of the betrayed or knocked back. Welcome to the world of being crushed and not satisfying ourselves. In the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, took some matzah. He gave thanks, broke it, and said, Zegufi, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. By the way, it never says, which is broken for you. No verse that says, this is my body, which is broken for you.
Who used
Given.
the word broken?
A lot of churches do, because then they break the bread. And they call that the breaking of bread. But when you do that, you misunderstand. He was never broken. Psalm 22, not any of his bones are broken. So the word broken is not in the Greek. It's not anywhere. We always break bread at the beginning of every Jewish meal. We call it, you want to come break bread with me. So when he'd given thanks, he broke it, the bread, not himself, and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, he took the cup also after supper. So it'd be the third cup, wasn't it? This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So we're doing something every time we take the Lord's Supper, the Messiah's Supper. We're doing it. It's a thing. And what is it? A reflection of Passover, deliverance, not only from Egypt, but from sin. And we are proclaiming that, the death of Messiah, until he comes. We won't be taking communion in heaven. We're only going to do this until he comes. So what's his correction to the boys here in Corinth? He says in verse 17, in giving this instruction, I'm not praising you because you come together not for the better, but for the worse. Look, when you come together as a church, he says in 18, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it. He's already commented on that in chapter 1 and 2. For there must be factions so that those who are approved may become evident. They're going to become phaneros, evident. So when you come together, verse 20, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. Why are you doing that? You're supposed to be doing it in the right way, but you're not. You're really doing it to eat your own supper. That's what he's correcting them. Paul really wants them to be imitators of Messiah, and he wants them to bring glory to God, both in their married life and in their single life. He's already commented on that in chapter 7. And he wants them to bring glory to God when they come together and they have a meeting. And we're going to see that in chapter 14, again, about what they're supposed to do when they have a gathering, kind of like a one new man meeting. So when you meet together, it's not to eat, verse 20, the Lord's Supper, for in your eating, each one takes his own supper first. One's hungry, another's drunk. What? Don't you have houses in which to eat and drink? You despise the church and shame those who have nothing. There's that word again, shame. That is the theme. The flip side of glory is bringing shame. And that's what he's pounding in this chapter tonight. You bring shame on those who have nothing. What should I say? Should I praise you? Yeah, that's not going to happen. In this I shall not praise you, because I received from Yeshua what I passed on. For as often as you eat this and drink, you proclaim the Lord's death. Therefore, verse 27, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner is guilty of the body and blood. So here's what I recommend, verse 28. Let a man examine himself, and in so doing, then he can eat of the bread and drink of the cup. If you eat and drink judgment to yourself. If you don't judge the body right. What's judging the body right? Figuring out who's who in the body of Messiah. It has nothing to do with you being personally holy. It's saying, hey, that brother, that sister, we're in this family together. He's saying, I know there's divisions, but don't do that. Don't sit in your clique. Hang out with everybody. Everybody's your brother. Everybody's your sister. You get together, you love one another. Then you'll understand that he really died for our sins and rose from the dead. And he said, this is my body. Do this in remembrance of me. Don't do this because you're prominent. Don't drink this because you were, do this in remembrance of me. He's saying be Jesus focused. And if you do that, you'll love one another. And if you don't love one another, then you're not Jesus focused. It's the converse. If we judged ourselves right, we wouldn't be judged. When we are judged, we're disciplined by the Lord so that we won't be condemned. I love that in verse 32. If we're judged, verse 32, we're disciplined so that we're not condemned. It's a stopgap. It's a preventative of getting worse treatment. When God disciplines us, it's to prevent our going to hell. That's really love. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. Verse 33. Don't just hop right up there. It's the potluck supper, the agape, the love feast, they called it in Corinth and other places. This gathering where you take the Lord's Supper. Wait for each other. If somebody's hungry, starving, like kids say, eat at home. So have a peanut butter sandwich before you come to the agape. Don't say, I gotta have some. I'm going to the back. I'm going to pretend to go to the restroom, but I'm going to go back and eat 3 latkes. Honor one another and honor Messiah in his headship over you. And don't be so self-consumed. Don't be your own food consumed. Don't get drunk. Verse number 21. You've got homes to eat and drink in. So when you come together, love one another. And that's the tradition that he heard from Messiah, that he passed on to the Corinthians, and he wanted them to maintain and follow. Remember, he got taught by the Lord privately for 3 to 14 years after he came to faith. There's argument about how long he was out in the wilderness. He anticipated these guys being contentious because they fight each other all the time. Well, one of you says you're from Paul. One says you're from Apollos. One says you're from Paul. So he knows their nature is to be argumentative and contentious. It's not only ineffective in outreach, it's ineffective in communication about who we are to one another. So the whole point is, let's bring Messiah's love to each other, and then let's pass that on to the outsiders too. Honor women, honor men, honor folks. Honor those who are hungry, who don't have anything. Let them eat first. Relax. That kind of thing.
Just in your own simple words, explain to me the covering of the head and putting on the headgear and not. A woman has to uncover her head.
No, she has to have her head covered. That's right. If she has long hair, that's a cover in itself. Because she can, if you will, wrap her head.
Short hair?
She has to wear a head covering. These are Jews and Gentiles. First century tradition, certainly in temple worship and in the community of the church. Verse 10, therefore the woman ought to have, our version says, a symbol of authority, but the word a symbol of isn't there. And some versions say a veil over her head, but the word veil isn't there. It's the simple Greek word exousia, meaning authority, because of the angels. So that's another celestial thing. And remember, he's arguing from creation, nature, and theology. He argues from creation just like Yeshua does in an argument about divorce. He says it wasn't so from the beginning, and he argues from Genesis and creation. So the Apostle Paul, who learned it well, is arguing from creation as well, that the angels who were there at creation would sort out a divine order of things. So woman submissive to man, man submissive to Messiah, Messiah submissive or subordinating himself to the Father. Again, only in role, not in equality, only in function. Nobody's better than anybody else. You hear that, you've really learned it.
But in that sentence, he uplifts the woman.
He does.
Symbol of authority.
She's not to be stepped on. No, and you don't see that in the Apostles' conversation about women ever. In 1 Timothy, here, and in Ephesians 5. You just don't see it. Women are honored.
You've been listening to the Bible class of Jews for Jesus in Australia. For more information, contact Jews for Jesus, Post Office Box 925, Sydney, Australia 2001. God bless you.